I created this years ago, and it's sort of cheesy now when I sort of look at it in relation to all the other stuff that I've done about neurons and synapses and stuff. I did this at the very beginning of my ability to do anything in Flash. But if you do a search for introduction to perception, it turns out this is actually like in the top 10, about 10 million or 20 million different places. I'm not as proud about that as I am my rankings for like neurons and synapses and whatnot, but it does its job because there are lots of people, grade school kids and as well as high school kids and college kids will read this. But the thing is, when we talk about perception, we tend to privilege visual perception above all the other senses. But strictly speaking, that's not the case. So the purpose here is just to introduce you to what exactly perception is. And the purpose of that in this context is to set up what Hanson's doing in this piece observation. So here's the thing. You've got an object here at A, at B, at C, and at D. And I'm not talking about the letter being the object. I'm talking about what A names or refers to and so on for B, C, and D. And the question is, well, what are you observing? And the answer is, well, sure, you could say that A, as you look at A, you're observing a picture of the 16th President of the United States, that is, a picture of Abraham Lincoln, a picture of a guy born in Kentucky, became president after, yada, yada. There's a lot of stuff you could say, but you're not just observing that. You're observing his tie and his jacket. If I ask you to tell me what you're observing with B, well, you're observing Bugs Bunny. You're also seeing, the carrot. You're seeing a picture of a cartoon character with a partially eaten carrot. You're seeing a picture of Elmer Fudd's nemesis, and so on and so on, right? You with me? But it turns out that as I ask you to view each of these objects as you're sitting there in the audience looking at the computer screen or looking at the screen here, that you're not just observing the image of those four objects, that you're also observing the boundaries, in this case, of the screen. You're also observing the dry erase board. You're observing the blueness of the wall that it's on, and the lights, and so on. So you're actually seeing a lot more than you're attending to. And the purpose of this is to illustrate that there's a difference between seeing and perceiving. Seeing occurs whenever your eyes are open and your visual system is doing what your visual system does. Perception requires awareness of what it is that you're perceiving. So for instance, right now, you're probably not attending to or aware of the hum that thing's been making the entire class because you sort of tune it out. You're not aware of the feel of the seat on your ass, right, as you're sitting in the chair because you're not attending to it. But you can direct your attention to it. So there's a difference between sensing something through vision or through audition or through whatever and perceiving it. Perceiving it requires awareness. And generally speaking, perceiving requires not just awareness of it, but the recognition of the thing as an object of a certain sort. Perception requires more than simply letting the visual system do what the visual system does. It's recognizing something as an object of a particular thing. And that's an important issue for Hanson in his defense of the notion that observation in science is always theory-laden, the theory-ladenness of observation, that we'll always bring our past experiences to bear upon our interpretations of what it is that we see, and that's part of perception. So we're talking about perception again. We're not just talking about vision. There's a difference between sensation and perception, whereas the sensation or the sense is going to be vision. It's obviously we're able to see and audition and hearing and somatosensation, touch, olfaction for smell, and gustation for taste, that we can perceive through any of our senses. But there's a difference between sensing something and perceiving something. Perception requires awareness. This is the point I'm simply trying to make. And we can perceive through more than our sense of vision. It's 2 pages long. It's really easy to get. Any questions about this? Okay. I wanted to do this just to set up that there's a difference between sensing something and perceiving something, and the reasons why perception matters, and I'll ignore that here. Go to PowerPoint, go to Hanson. See, I fixed the Hanson one, the title here. Go to... That's what happens when you try to do too much in too little time. All right, so here's an image of Hanson. Norwood Russell Hanson is his name, but he typically went by the letters here. There weren't a lot of images of him, so I thought this was the coolest one. Notice that he lived until 1967. What does that make him? 44? Huh? 40, yeah, pretty young guy when he died. American, he's mainly a philosopher of science, or in fact, better would be the philosopher of the history and philosophy of science. Before going to college, or certainly graduate school, he ends up joining the Coast Guard first and then transferring over to the Marine Corps to become a fighter pilot in World War II in the Pacific. He had a reputation for being very, very... Yeah, I mean, because he was a Golden Gloves boxer, and he was an artist. He's a really cool guy.
Successful fighter pilots are usually very aggressive.
Aggressive, yeah. He ends up getting out of the military and gets multiple degrees from multiple universities in a variety of subjects, which include history as well as in science and philosophy. And I'm mentioning this because at the time, there were no departments of history and philosophy of science. He created the first one at Indiana University. And this is thanks to Hanson and his book, Patterns of Discovery, which is his most important book, An Inquiry into the Conceptual Foundations of Science. We've got Kuhn's publication of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions 4 years later. Kuhn, Chicago, Princeton, departments of history and philosophy of science. They're the first guys really to not just introduce the notion that the history and the philosophy of science matters to the understanding of science, but we end up having not just a paradigm shift within philosophy. I mean, their works get used outside of philosophy in a variety of different disciplines because they end up identifying not just historical factors, but social factors and other factors that bear upon the acceptance of theory and how one theory ends up being chosen or accepted versus another. So he's known for a number of things. One of them is this theory-relatedness of observation, which we'll talk about today, as well as did important work in the nature of scientific discovery and the history of science. So it's too bad. I mean, I think he was working on 10 different books, at the time of his death. He died in a plane crash in, New Jersey, I think? In any event.
Was he flying, or was he...
No, he was flying.
He was doing the flying.
Yeah. But evidently it was very bad weather that day, fog, something. In any event, this is Hanson. All right, open your text to the piece Observation. And I like this word artifact that he uses here in that first couple of sentences. He says, consider two microbiologists. They look at a prepared slide. When asked what they see, they may give different answers. One sees in the cell before him a cluster of foreign matter. It is an artifact, how do you pronounce that? Coagulum, resulting from inadequate staining techniques. This clot has not more to do with the cell in vivo than the scars left on it by the archaeologist Spade have to do with the original shape of some Grecian urn. The other biologist identifies the clot as a cell organ, a Golgi body. As for techniques, he argues the standard way of detecting a cell organ is by fixing and staining. Why single out this one technique as producing artifacts while others disclose genuine organs? The controversy continues. He says it involves the whole theory of microscopical technique, nor is it an obviously experimental issue, yet it affects when scientists affects what scientists say that they see. Perhaps there is a sense in which the two observers do not see the same thing and do not begin with the same data, though their eyesight is normal and they are visually aware of the same object. This is the example that he has at the beginning. I don't think sets it up quite as nicely as the Kepler-Brahe example that he mentions later. But he says, again, he's sort of setting up the issue. So I'll go to the Kepler, Brahe. He says these biological examples are too complex. Yes, that's the reason why I'm skipping over them. Let us consider Johann Kepler. He says, imagine him on a hill watching the dawn. With him is Tycho Brahe. Kepler regarded the sun as fixed. It was the earth that moved, but Tycho, following Ptolemy and Aristotle, in this much at least, the earth is what was fixed. All the other celestial bodies moved around it. Do Kepler and Tycho see the same thing in the east as the dawn approaches? So here we have an image of Tycho Brahe. We have an image of Johann Kepler. They did overlap, in their time. It was possible for them to have actually sat watching the sunrise, over some hill, though it didn't never happen, obviously. Brahe, he's an interesting character for a variety of reasons, one of which is, and this is not a very good image of him, but he lost the bridge of his nose in a duel over a mathematical equation once. And usually the paintings of him, it's much more pronounced. So it looks like it's sort of a pig nose here, when in fact he's got this little gold metal cover on his nose that he ended up wearing for the rest of his life. And that's sort of a scary image of Kepler, but here's the idea. One of them believed that the sun remained fixed and the objects in our solar system revolved around the sun. The other believed that it was the sun that moved around the earth, and it was the earth that was fixed. So Brahe believed that it was the sun that went around the earth. Kepler believed that it was the earth that went around the sun. Yes?
Sense and reference, like they both perceive, or they both see the same referent, but they're approaching it through different senses.
And you're exactly right here. You're exactly right. That it's possible for them to, that is, all things being equal, the visual experience they're having is the same. But are they seeing the same thing when they're both sitting next to one another, maybe having a glass of wine, watching the sunrise, What is it that they see when this glowing orb goes over the top of the hill? So, according to Brahe, what they see is, they see the sun. They'll both call it the sun. And all things being equal, we can imagine that their visual experiences are going to be the same. So, there's no way of distinguishing whether one's vision is more clear than the other, or whether they're exactly the same retinal image that gets projected and gets transduced. But the issue here is, are they seeing the same object? For Brahe, he's seeing an object that rotates around the earth. Kepler's seeing an object that the earth rotates around it. So, what does Hanson make of this?
It's a primary problem. How do we define this whole issue of are they seeing the same thing, or are they not? What reference do we use to?
Well, for those of you who've had me for philosophy of language or analytic philosophy, you've encountered this kind of stuff before, right? Mm-hmm. But the issue here is, should we define observation simply in terms of the visual system doing what the visual system does? Is that all observation is? Mm-mm. No, it's not. In the same way that I was saying, before we got to this stuff, that there's a difference between sensation and perception. We do not want to consider observation to be simply that bare sort of presentation of the visual image that we see. And Hanson's going to be defending the notion that it's going to be our past experience that we bring to bear to interpret what it is that we see that ends up affecting our perception of it. So perception, for him, always is going to have with it this intended interpretation based on our past experience, and through which we're able to see two people with the same visual system, all things being equal, will nevertheless see different things. That is, metaphysically speaking, seeing different things. That is, the object, the referent remains the same, but the meaning of it changes based on their experience. Now, I suspect, given this class, you're not as troubled by that. But many people, maybe without much of a philosophy bent, would say, no. It's just the visual system doing what the visual system does, and I'm simply reporting what I'm seeing. And it doesn't work that way. And I think his examples are pretty good in that respect. So the question here he asks is, do Kepler and Tycho see the same thing, in the east at dawn? And we're not going to settle by saying, yes, they do, no, they don't, yes, they do, no, they don't. Yes.
Couldn't you say they see the same thing, but they don't perceive the same thing? Isn't that the true gist of this?
That is, sensation-wise, they're seeing the same thing.
Yeah.
But perception-wise, they're not. Because perception includes not just the awareness of the thing, right? It's the recognition of it as a thing of a certain sort, which you do through bringing your interpretation based on past experience to bear upon it. So you're looking at an object and my looking at an object. We may be looking at the same object referentially speaking, but the meaning of it, the semantics is going to change because, well, maybe you're more familiar with the object than I am, right? And it's those kinds of examples that he brings up here. So he says, and I like this reference to Locke. He says, Locke sometimes spoke of seeing in this way. A man sees the sun if his normally fitted retinal picture of the sun. That is, Dr. Sir W. Russell Brain, I like that name here, speaks of our retinal sensations as indicators and signals. Everything taking place behind the retina is, as he says, an intellectual operation based largely on non-visual experience. What we see are the changes in yada, yada, yada. Dr. Ida Mann regards the macula of the eye as itself, seeing details in bright light in the rods, seeing approaching motor cars, yada, yada, yada. The eye seeing for itself, I mean, that's the point. That people often speak as if it's the eye that sees, which is wrong, right? It's you, the agent, that sees through the goings-on that begins in your eyes and your visual cortex. It's not the eye that sees. What's wrong by saying that the eye sees such and such, or the ear hears?
The microscope doesn't say anything.
That's not the answer to my question. What's
No,
wrong?
it's-
What's wrong with saying that the eye sees?
Because it's you that sees or you that hears, the particular individual agent sees and hears because everything's got to come through the motions of your brain, or if you're some other machine, whatever counts for a brain.
Yeah, that is.
To be interpreted.
Perception. We have perception.
That's true. We're the
Right.
agents, right? We're the ones that bring the interpretational mechanisms to bear.
All the eye sees is light, but we see an object.
No, but you just committed this in there. So all the eye sees. Does the eye see anything?
Well, no, it receives light. How about that?
That's the eye does that. There's the retinal image that's
Yeah.
projected, right?
It collects light. How about that? But we see the object because of this light.
All right. So is it just a fast and loose way of talking when someone says that the eye sees, right? Or do they literally mean that? Because if they literally mean that, we're running into
Yeah,
problems.
because you wouldn't say his eye saw that. You would say he saw that, right?
Well, here's the thing. You can even in scientific textbooks, like one of the.
sees what the eye sees, like sort of.
But beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Stop there, all right? When you read a textbook on neuroscience, for instance, you'll find that the author will often refer to the neuron as processing information, or as recognizing something, or as all this intentional vocabulary that we're ascribing to the neuron, right? Which is bad, because in order to explain how it is that I'm able to perceive, I end up committing what's called a homunculus fallacy. I'm attributing to the parts that make it possible for me to perceive the very thing I'm trying to explain. And you don't explain it that way, because then you've got to explain how the eye is able to do it, and then how the thing in the eye is able to do that, and that's bad. So from a philosophy of language standpoint, we should probably clean up our vocabulary and not refer to the eyes as having the property of the thing that we want to explain here. So there's a difference between my seeing something and the eye seeing it. Because if it's the eye that's doing it, then the eye is the agent and I'm not the agent. So I like the fact that he's making this point. He says, this need not be pursued, however. These writers speak carelessly. Seeing the sun is not seeing retinal pictures of the sun. The retinal images which Kepler and Tycho have are 4 in number. And that's true. You each got 2 eyes, or 4 retinal images, inverted and quite tiny. Astronomers cannot be referring to these when they say that they see the sun. I like that. So here he says, seeing is an experience. People, not their eyes, see. And that there's more to seeing than meets the eyeball is the quote that he makes there, and I like that quote. So he says, both men see the same object, namely this object, whatever it is. Unless both are visually aware of the same object, then there can be nothing of philosophical interest in the question on whether or not they see the same thing. So, do they see the same thing is the issue. And it's not going to be the sense datum, right? So something about their visual experience at dawn is the same for both of them. A brilliant yellow-white disk centered between green and blue color patches. I mean, that all much is the same. But then at the bottom of that paragraph, he says, insofar as two normal observers use the language of the same event, they begin from the same data. They are making the same observation. Differences between them must arise in the interpretations they put on the data. And this is the first proponent of this view that ends up being referred to as the theory-relatedness of observation. So thus, to summarize, saying that Kepler and Tycho see the same thing at dawn just because their eyes are similarly affected is an elementary mistake. There is a difference between the physical state and the visual experience. And the visual experience is part of that perception, and perception requires awareness. And it's seeing something as something. And for him, seeing is always seen as. Perception is always seen as. And in order to see it as something, as an obstacle, as food, as a potential whatever, that requires experience and interpretation. Yes? That awareness is not physically what? I don't know.
I know he doesn't address it here, but it seems like that's what he's implying. Since he can't use
I see. So that part of what makes consciousness conscious states is awareness. Otherwise, you wouldn't be conscious. And we can't reduce consciousness to...
just as we can't reduce vision to the physical states that result in the eye processing.
Yeah.
We can't do the same.
Even though consciousness arises from the physical goings on in the brain, we can't localize it in the way that we can, say, localize the neurons responsible for my being able to see something. But there's an awareness there, right? I think he's probably comfortable with that. But since he wrote this, I mean, we've made quite a bit of progress in understanding the nature of the different attentional systems that we have and how it is that we're able to be aware of things. But that seems to be crucial for understanding of consciousness, which is a big and important topic, right, in philosophy of mind and philosophy of science. He gives another example here. It looks like we're not going to finish the Hanson stuff. Having to do with this figure. What's the name of this figure, by the way? What's this called? It's not a box. It's a Necker cube is what it is. All right. What, if anything, is interesting about what you see here? So I ask you, what do you see? What are you observing when you look at this? You say a box. That's a 3D object?
It's a two-dimensional depiction of 12 lines.
Representation of three-dimensional.
This is, say that again, Brent.
It's a two-dimensional depiction of a three-dimensional.
That's true. All right. Now, what are you seeing?
12 lines.
Oh, no, that's true in the sense of what are you perceiving when I asked that, for the Mind Project stuff. That is, where's the top, where's the bottom here?
Top is higher.
It could be an open box. There's no top on it.
I don't think that's not the point of this example. The point of this example is that by shifting your attention to different points as you're looking at this, you end up seeing different objects. So, can anyone describe?
I can see a box tilted on its right side, so the opening is facing the right, and then I can see a box if you stand it back up, if you look at it in a certain way.
And maybe because of the distance we are here on this side from the center of this, it may be harder for you to do this, but you should be able to stare at the image and the text and focus your attention in one spot and see the object where this is the top and this is the front, and focus your attention on another spot and you end up seeing the object a different way. That is, all things being equal, the visual information doesn't change. It doesn't become one kind of box in one way and another kind of box in another way when you do this. It's rather the shift in your attention causes you to see the object in different ways. It's an ambiguous figure. It is ambiguous because of the poverty of information in the visual stimulus. That based on where it is that you're attending, where your focus of attention is, you're going to see the object one way, you're going to see the object another way. It doesn't mean the object, metaphysically speaking, is changing between these two things. You with me? This isn't an example of the theory-relatedness of observation. knowing as you do, and you need to observe this for yourself, otherwise it's.
Yeah, it just did it to me. It literally went from the left side to the right side, it actually moved. It was very disconcerting.
When you blink, you'll get a shift a lot of the time.
But knowing as you do that what you perceive is dependent on where it is that you're attending doesn't really bear upon your seeing it one way versus another way. I mean, knowing all that stuff doesn't, it's not like looking at it, knowing that changes your perception of it, right? Your perception of it changes based on where it is that you're looking. So this isn't meant to illustrate the theory relatedness of observation. Instead, this, from a psychological or neuroscientific standpoint, is an example of an ambiguous figure, and its ambiguity arises because of the poverty of the stimulus here. This is another very famous example. What do you see?
But then I see.
All right, how is it that you see this as a duck?
There's a
went
Where are
here
you
first.
attending in order to see this as a duck?
Beak.
That is, if you attend here, what does this end up being? That's the eye. And this is
The beak.
the beak. All right. Can you see this as another object?
Yeah.
Rabbits.
rabbit.
And how is this a rabbit?
The little divot over
It's
there
a
is
really
a mouth,
small
and then
mouth.
What?
the
How do I
eye
see a
is-
rabbit?
Look, it's mouth. And it's ear.
If you attend here,
Oh, yeah.
Point
That's
it at
but his ears are like way back there.
Yeah,
he up
that's more
here.
duck than rabbit.
maybe he's chilling, sure. But the reason I chose this particular example of the duck rabbit is because of the poverty of the visual information. You can do searches for duck rabbit. We get this from Wittgenstein, right? The issue is, does this object sort of magically?
Oh, yeah, it just did it.
Good
It just
deformed
just
duck,
happened to me.
Does it go, metaphysically speaking, from a duck to a rabbit? No. What changes is where it is that you attend, and when you attend in one place, you'll see it as a duck. When you attend to another place, you'll see it as a rabbit. This isn't exactly the same as his original example, because here you're only able to see it as a duck if you've seen ducks, if you've had experience with ducks or images of ducks, so you can interpret it that way. Similarly goes for the rabbit. Not so with the box, the Necker cube. It's a little different there. All right, I didn't finish Hanson. I'll pick that up when we get back on Tuesday. Who's doing the presentation on Tuesday? Is anyone here? I didn't pay attention who was doing that. Well, maybe no one. All right, well, we'll finish this and do whatever was assigned for Tuesday when we come back on Tuesday. Let's turn our attention to Hanson. Quickly go to presentation here. Remind ourselves that we're dealing with questions, in the end, these are metaphysical questions about the status of these entities that we can't observe. So it's natural for us to consider sort of the nature of observation and the role observation plays in science, which we do with Hanson's piece. I'm not going to review all this. But one of the examples that Hanson gives us is where we've got these two guys, Tycho Brahe, Johannes Kepler, sitting on a hill watching the sunrise. And visually speaking, they're having a very similar experience. I mean, they've got the same, all things being equal, primate visual system. The experience they're having of what it is that they're seeing is, for all intents and purposes, the same. But are they seeing the same thing? And you can defend the position that they're not. Because what they're seeing isn't simply the retinal image that gets transduced that's the basis of the visual experience they have. Rather, what they're seeing is the object out there. It's the reference. And for one of them, what they're seeing, that is that glowing orb, is an object that rotates around the Earth. What the other is seeing is a stationary object around whom the Earth rotates. So those are very real differences in conceptual schemes. They have a lot of things in common too. I mean, they both would accept that the sun, produces heat. That it's not going to suddenly transform into a bunch of ice cubes. I mean, they've got a lot of things in common in their conceptual schemes when they interpret what they're seeing. But one of the things that Hanson's emphasizing is that, yes, in particular, scientists bring their experiences to bear upon their reports of what they're observing. But they're not necessarily doing it by observing and then bringing this cognitive component to bear in order to interpret what they're seeing. For him, it's an unconscious kind of automatic process. but this is important here because observation plays a key role in testing as well as in scientists telling us what exists, because they're in the business of telling us what exists as well as explaining why it is that way and predicting how it's going to be in the future. And if it turns out that the observation reports of scientists aren't really neutral, then it sort of calls into question the ontological status of things that scientists are committing us to the existence of. So having set that up, he talks about these kinds of ambiguous figures where, due to directing your attention to one place, you see one thing, and you direct your attention to another place, you see something else. You're not sort of mentally imposing an interpretation on it. It just happens automatically as a result of your bringing your intentional mechanisms to bear upon this ambiguous figure. As a visual stimulus goes, this is a very impoverished stimulus, and this is part of the reason why you can shift your attention in a way and see it one way and see it another way. Now, have we all established that we can see this as a box with one orientation and as a box with another orientation? You with me here? When you do that, you're not saying, well, now I'm going to will myself, knowing that I can perceive it this way or that way, to see it this way or that way. Instead, you see it this way or that way, depending on where it is that you're looking, given the way your intentional mechanisms work. You're not bringing an interpretation to bear upon it and then interpreting it in a different way. Okay? Another example, and this is a famous philosophy example, is the duck rabbit, right, which we get from Wittgenstein. This is another ambiguous figure. Now, granted, you wouldn't interpret this as a duck or a rabbit unless you've had experiences with duck or rabbits. Do you think that, this is a bit of a conjecture, right, but imagine you've got, I don't know, some city kid. It's hard to imagine someone not seeing little ducks or rabbits, at least in books or whatever, but do you think that a kid raised in a rural urban environment would look at this and interpret it as a duck in one way and as a rabbit in another? Is that reasonable, you think?
You've never seen a duck or a rabbit?
Yeah. Suppose we went to the bush, the Amazon. Probably shouldn't use that example because we usually use that for Gavagai and, being rabbit or undetached rabbit parts. But the point is, when you see it as a duck, you see it as a duck because you're attending where? You're looking where? Where are you looking in order to see this as a duck?
Its beak, its neck.
You're looking to the left, you're looking at the beak and the eye, and
So you're looking
you see a
around
neck,
here?
Yeah,
and
that
then
somewhere?
point where it comes back in.
Say that again?
The point where it would be in the inside of the beak, back towards the head.
All right, and then where are you looking in order to see this as a rabbit?
then you look to the right, to the little mouth, then you see the eye, then those become ears.
So around here.
Right.
Right. Now, are you having the visual experience and then bringing your cognitive faculties to bear upon it in order to interpret what you're seeing, or are you just seeing it that way?
And this one, I think it's cognitive faculties, the other one, yeah.
Yeah, I find myself interpreting certain things as either ears or beaks in this one.
And that's all based on past experience, yes, no question about it. But for Hanson, it's really not a two-stage process. It's a kind of automatic process where you bring your past experience to bear upon it. Now, you can reflect on it, because we're cognitive beings, and say, well, I think it's a better duck than a rabbit. There's more resemblance here to the duck than a rabbit. But all things being equal, I think this is a similar example to the Necker cube example, where due to shifting your attention, you end up seeing it one way, then you end up seeing it another way. Okay? He says, the next example has to do with this cathode ray tube, this X-ray tube. Do you have the figure in your book?
Yeah.
Okay. I think this is better because it's a actual image, right? So as you look at this object, what do you see? Visually speaking, your visual experience and your visual experience and your visual experience are all things being equal, the same. You're all seeing, essentially, in one sense, the same thing, but there's another sense in which you're not. So I'm a layman when it comes to the construction of cathode ray tubes and their roles and how they function. A scientist who uses these or designs these or relies on instruments that have these as components is going to see this in a slightly different way. So visually speaking, the experience is the same, and we can all agree about that. But what they're seeing is different. And for Hanson, what the scientist sees, he's not seeing by having the visual experience and then interpreting it. It's just an automatic kind of process. Whereas what I see, visually speaking, is the same, but the object is different. What a child sees, visually speaking, is going to be the same, but what the child sees is different. So let me emphasize this point. He says that would, underneath that figure, he says, would Sir Lawrence Bragg and an Eskimo baby see the same thing when looking at an X-ray tube? Well, yes and no. Yes, they are visually aware of the same object. No, the ways in which they are visually aware are profoundly different. Seeing is not only having a visual experience, it is also a way in which the visual experience is had. And it's your past experiences will sort of shape how it is that you end up interpreting what it is that you're seeing. And then he says, on the couple paragraphs over, that he goes, this obtains in all seeing, that's seen as something. Attention is rarely directed to the space between the leaves of a tree, yada, yada, yada. He says, our attention most naturally rests on objects and events which dominate the visual field. What a booming, buzzing, and undifferentiated confusion visual life would be if we all arose tomorrow without attention capable of dwelling only on what had heretofore been overlooked. The infant and the layman can see, they are not blind, but they cannot see what the physicist sees. They are blind to what he sees. And I like the example about the oboe. We may not hear that the oboe was out of tune, though this will be painfully obvious to the trained musician, who, incidentally, does not hear the tones and interpret them as being out of tune. He simply will simply hear the oboe out of tune. What do you think about that? Are any of you musically inclined? Any of you play something? Would you hear something and just automatically recognize that something's out of tune?
Yeah.
Definitely.
I don't know if I would. I mean, because I don't know if I'm tone deaf, but I don't play anything. I don't spend a lot of time with music.
It'd be a little difficult with an oboe in particular.
Maybe so.
Yeah.
But the thing is, when do you hear it and then interpret it, or do you just interpret it?
Sort of like it's a cringe.
Yeah.
It's
It just doesn't
instantaneous.
sound right when it's out of tune.
That's what?
It just, intuitively, it doesn't sound right when it's out of tune. I don't really know how.
Just because of the dissonance?
Describe it.
I mean, would I have the same?
I can't, yeah. Maybe.
It's because you're used to, if you play scales, you're used to, you anticipate the next movement.
Something
I
I've never
couldn't
done?
tell you what note it was, but I can tell you that it's not within that scale.
You anticipate the relation of tones in a scale if you play it enough, so.
But again, he's saying that we do not hear and then interpret them, in this case, as being out of tune. We simply hear the oboe being out of tune, or at least someone that's,
Right.
musically inclined.
I think that's the same kind of effect that modern dissonant composers are trying for. They're deliberately creating sounds that don't seem to fit
Yeah.
in the preconceived notion of what we would have expected to hear. So they create a sound that's out of. So I mean I don't know if it's anticipation that's at work here.
And there have been revolutions in past like musical theory. Like harmony used to be perceived as dissonance, like what we think of as harmonics now, like notes that
Right.
go well together. Used to just be perceived as dissonance, like everything was just the same note.
Oh yeah, and mathematical progression of chords. I mean, we've got there's a lot of history in this. But the point of all this is that someone who's an expert musician, right, was going to hear something differently without necessarily bringing their interpretational mechanisms to bear upon it. They just happen sort of instantaneously based on their past experience. In the same way that when the scientist who's familiar with equipment that requires these objects looks at it, they're seeing something different. Visually speaking, they're having the same experience, but there's also a sense in which, well, they're not, right? And they're not because of their past experience sort of being brought to bear upon this. They see it as a different object. So the issue here, philosophically speaking, is this a difference that makes a difference? Is this interesting at all?
It kind of functions the same way, not really the same way, but like humor, by setting something up and then your brain having to rectify it. You don't think about it. You just laugh because you know it hits that this does not fit.
Well, I get a little uncomfortable when we start saying that the brain's doing this and the brain's doing that, because then it seems as if the brain's the agent and I'm not the agent, right? There are clearly occasions when we do need to reflect upon what we're sensing, right, in order to interpret. Maybe it's ambiguous in the case of visual stimuli, or it's a low enough tone, we can't quite discriminate between it being this and it being something else. So there are occasions when we do that. What he's talking about are those sort of ordinary sort of occasions when we look at objects and there's a sense in which we're having the same visual experience, but we're seeing different things. And metaphysically speaking, this is interesting, right? But if we start attributing, some unconscious or whatever, processing going on, that the brain's sort of doing this, then we run into metaphysical problems, because then it's not me that's seeing, it's the brain that's seeing.
I think the only thing the brain is in charge of is organizing the physical stuff, and that's what accounts for when he says that both of the astronomers are having the same vision. That's in the sense what the brain is accounting for. It's interpreting the raw data of experience.
It's interpreting.
No, not interpreting. You're right. That's the wrong.
But you realize we run into difficulties
Yeah.
when we're talking about how brains do what they do, because we end up sort of shifting the intentional vocabulary of us as the agents down to the very mechanisms that are doing it, and then we end up with what's called a homunculus fallacy, and that's not good.
So you process it or something.
Yeah, so but I'm just saying that there's a whole lot of literature out there from neuroscientists that speak in this as if sort of fast and loose fashion that sort of reduces, whatever the higher level cognitive stuff is that we as agents do and have, to the mechanisms that give rise to it. This is particularly true in studies about attention. I mean, think about it. You can attend to this and you can attend to this, and it's you that's attending. But there are occasions when you can't help but to attend to something because of, evolutionary pressures and adaptations that we have. I mean, when you look at, I don't have an example of this here, but I can create one sort of quickly. All right. If these were all green, well, you'd have to sort of look at it and sort of inspect it in order to be able to detect which of these is different. Say, if I were to make one a star, say, maybe it would stand out, maybe it wouldn't. The point is, when there's this one bit in the visual field that's different than all the others, it stands out. And I use red intentionally here because what does red generally mean in nature? Danger, right? So as primates, if we're in the jungle and we're going to see lots and lots and lots of green. If something's red, it's going to stand out. Our attentional mechanisms are such that we'll automatically attend to it. Now, we can override it by looking at something else, but this is the way, the visual system works. As Ramachandran puts it, it's kind of a bag of tricks. It's not producing the optimal image. It's producing something that's good enough, that's fast, that enables us to make judgments, in a quick and unconsidered way. So the point of all this, again, is that Hanson is a proponent of this notion about the theory-latedness of observation, right? That seen is always seen as. But that doesn't mean we're always interpreting in a kind of reflective, cognitive way what we're seeing and bringing our past experience explicitly to bear upon what it is that we're seeing. No, we can do that. But for him, what a scientist sees, what a layman sees, what a child sees, there's a sense in which they're all seeing the same thing, and there's a sense in which they're not. That the object, the reference, changes, in part because of the richer conceptual, intellectual role the object will play in the experience of the individual, regardless of whether it's the result of some sort of reflective thinking. The point here is that what it is that you're seeing might seem like a simple question, but it's really not that simple. And since we rely upon the observations of scientists to report what it is that they're seeing. I saw an example of this yesterday. I wish it happened so fast. I recognized it as an example of what it is that I wanted to talk about, but I couldn't figure out what the hell what the show was. But basically, you had these guys working, I think, through the Environmental Protection Agency, cleaning up some kind of disaster. And what the clip that I saw was of these guys saying they were under a lot of pressure. It's cost a lot of money in order to clean up some accident or whatever that happened in the environment. And what I could see was these 4 or 5 guys huddled around a scale as one guy's sort of pouring what looked like some kind of dirt onto a scale, and they were reading off a series of numbers that got higher and higher, and they were all very happy when it got to 30. Now, from my perspective, they were adding material to the scale. Of course, it's going to increase its weight, but somehow that translated into the elimination of some kind of contamination or whatever. So what I was seeing as a layperson looking at this wasn't what they were seeing. There are all kinds of examples out there. But when the issue concerns what exists, and we have to rely upon our observations to determine what exists, and here we're dealing with these theoretical, non-observable entities exist. It's all part of a larger sort of metaphysical framework. But we've got 2 other people we need to consider today. So this was Hanson, yes.
Do you think that it's possible that somebody can train themselves to be as much more objective? Like with the example of the sun setting, you could say the sun moved past the horizon. Do you think it's possible for somebody to reach that point where they're not trying to interpret it and just say what it and how it's interacting?
I don't think it's necessarily the right question. I think you can't help but to do that because it happens as a result, particularly in that example, of a kind of conversion experience. Mm-hmm. That once you've made the conversion to the new theory, you can't help but to see that object either as an object around whom all the other objects rotate, or if you accept the previous theory, the object that rotates around us. I mean, they have a lot of stuff in common in terms of their beliefs about the sun, but in the end, they're not seeing the same thing. Even though their visual experience, all things being equal, is the same, the role that object plays in their conceptual scheme is so radically different that it's reasonable for us to say that they're not seeing the same thing. But once you make the conversion, you just can't help. You can't shift your attention like we could with the ambiguous figures and say, see it this way in one way and see it this way in another way. Once you make the conversion, you can't go back.
Sort of like knowing the rules of baseball and watching a game versus not knowing the rules of watching. Like one of them is chaos and the other one makes sense.
I think that would apply in a lot of contexts.
Yeah.
Right? But there's a difference between, say...
Once you know the rules, it just, like, you can't see it as the previous chaos.
And in that sense, I agree with you. I think that works that way. That if you're watching, like, for instance, cricket, we can all, visually speaking, have the same experience as you watch cricket. But once you learn the rules, you're going to end up seeing it differently than you did before because you have a kind of conversion experience, right? You're not necessarily consciously rehearsing the rules as you're observing it, but you interpret it kind of automatically. Yes, and you end up seeing it as something that's different than you saw it before, even though visually speaking, it was the kind of same experience. That's Hanson's point.
I have no idea what they're doing.
It's interesting.
It's interesting.
Cartwheels the ball.
You should look it up. You should look it up. It's, in fact,
I should have a conversion experience.
But the same goes for like polo or rugby or
Yeah.
football.
Or American football, yeah.
That's true, exactly right.
Or even like Ender's Game. Like if you and I were both watching Ender's Game, I would see
Oh,
something
yeah.
and react very
Curling.
negatively because it's not what my mind like expects to happen. But you'd be like, oh man, that was really cool.
The Two Towers.
And I use examples like this in the class I'm teaching in the spring called Philosophy of the Art, right? Because there's a particular piece that I like to use, Picasso's Guernica, which is his masterpiece. And Guernica is the name of a city in Spain, and something bad happened there. For any of you that are going to take the class, I'm not going to look at and so there's he's got this very large, very famous piece titled Guernica, which is the name of a city in Spain. And even if you didn't know that, you can, visually speaking, look at it and recognize this object and this object maybe and this object. But once you actually understand what's being depicted and what these different objects symbolize, it's a kind of transformative experience that you end up seeing it in a completely different way. And this happens a lot with art. So titles of art tend to give us a direction in which to interpret something. But once we sort of know the history, maybe something about the intentions of the artist, the title, it gives us a richer sort of theoretical framework with which to interpret what it is that we're seeing, and we do literally end up seeing it as a different object, even though visually speaking it's the same. And this is what Hanson's talking about. So, and let's get out of this. Let's go to